The Unsent Letter, Chapter 1, The Invitation from the Past. The late autumn air in Salem, Massachusetts, carried the familiar scent of salt and ancient secrets. Eleanor Vance, a 40-year-old librarian, found solace in the quiet hum of the archives, in the orderly rows of books that held the collective memory of humanity. Her own memory, however, was a fractured landscape, dominated by a pervasive, unspoken sorrow. Her grandmother, Lillian Vance, had passed away peacefully a few months prior at a venerable age, leaving Eleanor with a quiet house, a lifetime of unanswered questions, and a pervasive sense of an unresolved past. Lillian had been a woman of quiet strength, but in her final years, dementia had begun to steal her lucidity, her whispers often trailing off into cryptic phrases. Miranda, the letter, he destroyed everything, the lie. Eleanor had always dismissed them as the ramblings of an aging mind, echoes of a bygone era. Then, one Tuesday morning, amidst a stack of bills and junk mail, Eleanor pulled out an envelope that sent a shiver down her spine. It was thick, cream-colored, with elegant, old-fashioned calligraphy. The return address was a prestigious, well-known estate on Martha's Vineyard. And the name of the sender, the jubilarian, caused her heart to seize in her chest. Miranda Blackwood, age 80. Miranda Blackwood. The name was a ghost, a whisper from her childhood. Miranda Blackwood was supposed to be dead for 40 years. Eleanor had grown up hearing fragmented tales of Miranda, her grandmother's best friend. They had been inseparable, two young women against the world. Then, 40 years ago, Miranda had vanished. The official story, whispered with hushed tones, was a tragic accident, a boating incident, a storm, a body never recovered. The case had been quickly closed. The official explanation accepted by a society unwilling to question the powerful Blackwood family. But Lillian, Eleanor now realized, had never truly believed it. Her grandmother's grief, a raw, silent wound, had never quite healed. Now, this elegant invitation, a physical manifestation of an impossible reality, shattered Eleanor's world. It wasn't just a shock, it was an earthquake, shaking the foundations of everything she thought she knew about her family, about Miranda, and about the nature of truth itself. The quiet ache of her grandmother's passing deepened, transforming into a burning need to uncover the secrets buried beneath decades of silence. The past, it seemed, was not as dead as she had been led to believe. Her first instinct was to confirm. She meticulously cross-referenced the address, the name, everything. It was indeed the Blackwood estate, and the date for the 80th birthday celebration was less than a week away. She spent hours sifting through old newspaper archives at the Salem Public Library, searching for any mention of Miranda Blackwood's accident. The results were frustratingly sparse. A brief notice, almost an afterthought, in the local papers from 40 years ago, reporting a presumed drowning off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. No details, no investigation, no follow-up. The case was closed with chilling speed. It was as if her existence had been erased. Eleanor recalled her grandmother's frantic murmurs in her last days, the unsent letter. The truth cannot be found. He destroyed everything. The he in those ramblings had always been a shadowy figure, undefined but menacing. Now a cold dread coiled in her stomach. Could it have been James Blackwood, Miranda's husband? He had been a powerful, influential man, a pillar of the community, revered and feared in equal measure. He had died of natural causes many years ago, long after Miranda's disappearance. But what if his pristine reputation was merely a facade? The invitation, a seemingly innocuous piece of stationery, felt like a gauntlet thrown. Eleanor knew she couldn't ignore it. It was a summons, a silent plea from a past that refused to stay buried. She felt a profound obligation to her grandmother, to the fragments of truth Lillian had desperately tried to convey in her final moments. She booked a ferry ticket to Martha's Vineyard for the following day. She needed to see this woman, Miranda Blackwood, with her own eyes. She needed to understand how a ghost could send a birthday invitation, and she needed to uncover the lie that had shrouded her grandmother's life in sorrow and silence for 4 decades. The hunt for the unsent letter, the hidden truth, had begun. Chapter 2, The Haunted Estate. The ferry ride to Martha's Vineyard was choppy, the gray December sky mirroring Eleanor's turbulent thoughts. The island, usually bustling with summer tourists, felt desolate, its grand homes shuttered against the harsh winter winds. The Blackwood estate, perched dramatically on a bluff overlooking the churning sea, appeared even more imposing than she'd imagined from photographs. A sprawling, Victorian Gothic mansion, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the vast, indifferent ocean. It exuded an air of elegant decay, of secrets held within its stone walls for far too long. As Eleanor approached the grand iron gates, she noticed they were slightly ajar, a sign of life, but also a hint of neglect. The sprawling gardens were overgrown. The paint on the once pristine facade was peeling in places. It looked less like a lively birthday venue and more like a mausoleum. She walked up the gravel driveway, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. Before she could knock, the massive oak front door creaked open. A man stood in the entryway, his face lined and weary, his eyes a startling shade of blue that immediately struck Eleanor as familiar. He was in his early 50s, his dark hair streaked with gray, dressed in practical, worn clothes. He carried an air of quiet solitude, a man who had lived with heavy burdens. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice low, tinged with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. "I'm Eleanor Vance," she began, her voice a little shaky. "I received an invitation for Miranda Blackwood's 80th birthday." Holding the elegant card, the man's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of surprise and something akin to recognition crossing his face. "Eleanor Vance? Lillian's granddaughter?" Eleanor nodded, stunned. "You know my grandmother?" He sighed, a deep, heavy sound. "I'm Thomas Blackwood," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, calloused. "Tommy, Miranda's my mother." Eleanor dimly remembered a few childhood photos of a fair-haired boy, much younger than Miranda, in the periphery of some old family albums. So Miranda had had a son. "The invitation," Tommy continued, his gaze distant. "It was an oversight, the mistake. My mother suffers from dementia. Her memory is largely gone. I'm her primary caregiver. I was going through some old guest lists, trying to organize things, and I suppose one of them got mailed by mistake. I apologize for any distress." Dementia, the word landed with a dull thud, Lillian's own final struggle. Eleanor felt a wave of crushing disappointment. Was this the end of her quest, a tragic dead end? "I'm so sorry to hear that," Eleanor said, genuinely saddened. My grandmother, Lillian, she spoke of your mother often. They were very close. Tommy's blue eyes softened, a hint of deep, buried pain emerging. They were. My mother, she loved Lillian very much. He paused, then as if making a snap decision, he stepped aside. Please come in. The house is a bit lived in. But you've come a long way. The interior of the Blackwood estate was a mausoleum of time. Dust motes danced in the shafts of weak winter light that pierced the gloom. Antique furniture was draped in white sheets. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down from the walls. It felt like a place where life had been put on hold decades ago. My mother is resting now, Tommy said, leading her through a vast, echoing drawing room. But perhaps you'd like some tea. And perhaps you can tell me about Lillian. As they sat in a small, cozy library, the only room that felt truly lived in, filled with stacks of books and a worn armchair, Eleanor spoke of her grandmother, her quiet life, her profound grief for Miranda. She carefully omitted the cryptic ramblings, the suspicions. She watched Tommy's face as she spoke, searching for clues. His blue eyes, so like Miranda's in the old photographs, were filled with a profound sadness. He listened intently, occasionally nodding. When Eleanor finished, a heavy silence settled between them. My mother, she had a difficult life, Tommy said finally, his gaze fixed on a distant point. My father, James Blackwood, he was a powerful man, very particular. He controlled everything. He paused, a flicker of something close to resentment, or perhaps fear, crossing his face, in his eyes. My mother, she vanished, as you know. The official story, it was accepted. I was only 10. I believed it, for a long time. He didn't elaborate, but the words hung in the air, hinting at a truth far darker than a simple accident. Eleanor felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the thread. My grandmother always spoke of an unsent letter, Eleanor ventured, testing the waters. She believed Miranda tried to reach out to her. Tommy's jaw tightened. He looked away, his gaze falling on a large, ornate desk in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. My father kept all the correspondence. He was meticulous about letters, especially incoming ones. He stood, walking towards the desk. This was his study. No one has touched it since he passed. He ran a hand over the dusty surface. He was very particular about his reputation. Any hint of scandal, he would crush it. Eleanor felt a growing sense of unease. Did your father? Did he ever mention any specific letters? Tommy shook his head. No, not to me. He just had a certain way of doing things. He gestured to a large antique globe on a stand beside the desk. He used to say, "Knowledge is control, Thomas, and control is power." Eleanor's gaze swept the room. It was dark, imposing, filled with heavy masculine furniture, a place of secrets. Her eyes landed on a subtle seam in the ornate wooden paneling behind the desk. Almost invisible against the dark wood, it looked like a hidden compartment. "May I look around, Thomas?" she asked, her voice calm. "Just for a moment?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Of course, I'll make that tea." He left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Eleanor moved quickly to the desk, her fingers tracing the hidden seam. With a gentle push, a small, narrow section of the paneling slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled amongst old financial ledgers and legal documents, were several thick, aged envelopes. She pulled them out, her heart hammering. They were official-looking, stamped with the seal of a private investigation firm. And the dates, they spanned years, long after Miranda's death. They contained surveillance reports, black and white photographs of a woman, older but undeniably Miranda, living a quiet, secluded life in a remote farmhouse in Maine. There were also thinly veiled threats, legal documents with clauses about discretion and non-disclosure, and most chillingly, letters from a young Tommy addressed to Mom, but never sent. Her stomach churned. James Blackwood hadn't believed Miranda was dead. He had been tracking her, and then at the bottom of the stack, she found it. A thick, yellowed envelope, familiar in its elegant handwriting. It was addressed to Eleanor Vance. The postmark was 40 years old. The wax seal was broken, the letter clearly intercepted. It was the unsent letter, the one Lillian had mourned, the one James Blackwood had intercepted. Eleanor pulled out the crumpled pages, her eyes scanning the familiar cursive. It was a letter from Miranda, frantic and desperate, detailing her escape from James's abusive control, her plans to start a new life, her plea for Lillian to meet her, to help her. It mentioned James's escalating threats, his obsession with his reputation, his refusal to let her leave him, alive or dead. A cold, horrifying realization washed over her. James Blackwood had not been the benevolent, grieving widower. He was a monster. He had orchestrated Miranda's death to prevent a divorce, and he had kept her a prisoner, an isolated ghost, for decades, using their son as leverage. The very man who was supposedly mourning her was the one who had condemned her to a living death. And Lillian, her grandmother, had been right all along. The truth had indeed been buried. And now, Eleanor was holding it in her hands. She knew what she had to do next. She had to find the lawyer. Chapter 3. The Lawyer's Confession. Eleanor clutched the unsent letter and the surveillance reports, her mind reeling. The air in James Blackwood's study suddenly felt heavy, suffocating with the weight of decades of deceit. Tommy's footsteps grew closer, returning with the tea. Eleanor quickly, but carefully, replaced the documents in the hidden compartment, sliding the panel shut, just as he entered. He handed her a steaming mug. "Are you all right, Eleanor? You look a bit pale." "I'm fine. Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. She knew she couldn't reveal everything to him yet. He had been a child, a pawn in his father's cruel game. But she needed to understand the full scope of James's machinations, and the lawyer was the key. "I was just thinking about how difficult it must have been for your mother, losing so much of her memory." Tommy's face softened with a familiar sadness. "It has been a long, hard road. She has moments, glimpses, but mostly she lives in a fog." Eleanor changed the subject, smoothly transitioning to a question about the family's legal affairs, subtly bringing up Mr. Harrison, the Blackwood family's longtime attorney. Tommy confirmed he was still alive, living in a quiet retirement community on the island, though frail. Eleanor left the Blackwood estate shortly after, politely declining Tommy's offer to stay longer. She needed to think, needed to plan, and she needed to see Mr. Harrison. The next day, Eleanor found Mr. Harrison's address. His home was modest, filled with books and the scent of pipe tobacco. He was a thin, stooped man in his 70s, with keen, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken stories. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice raspy with age, but clear. "I remember your grandmother, Lillian, a remarkable woman. What can I do for you?" Eleanor didn't waste time. She explained about the invitation, about her grandmother's last words, about the unsent letter and the surveillance reports she had glimpsed in James's study. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, seeing the slow, painful dawning of a long-buried secret in his eyes. Mr. Harrison sighed, a deep, shuddering breath. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling slightly. So, the truth, after all these years, is finally finding its way out. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze direct and unwavering. Your grandmother was a good woman, Miss Vance, and she deserved to know the truth. I regret not telling her myself. He paused, collecting his thoughts, then began to speak, his voice low and solemn, recounting a tale of control, fear, and ultimate betrayal. James Blackwood, Mr. Harrison began, his voice filled with a mixture of disgust and resignation, was a man obsessed with appearances. His reputation, his family name, his public image, these were his gods. He was a powerful man, ruthless in business, and utterly tyrannical in his private life. Miranda, she was too spirited for him, too independent. She wanted a life of her own. She wanted to leave him. Eleanor's heart tightened. This confirmed her darkest suspicions. 40 years ago, he continued, Miranda came to me. She told me she was going to divorce James. She had suffered enough. She wanted to take young Thomas and disappear. But James, he refused to allow it. A divorce would have been a scandal. It would have tarnished his perfect image. He told her he would destroy her. He would take Thomas away from her. He would make her disappear. Harrison's voice dropped to a whisper. I warned Miranda. I told her James was capable of anything. We discussed options, and then she came to me with a plan, a desperate one. She asked me to help her stage her own death. Eleanor gasped. She faked her own death? Yes, Mr. Harrison confirmed, his eyes filled with a distant sadness. With my reluctant help. I saw the fear in her eyes. I knew James was a dangerous man. She genuinely feared for her life and for Thomas's. We made it look like a boating accident. She disappeared, leaving behind a few personal items to imply she had drowned. I then helped her quietly move to a remote farmhouse in Maine, far from prying eyes. She wanted to contact Lillian, but I advised against it, at first. I believed James would be watching for any contact, any sign she was alive. The plan was for her to settle, and then for us to reconnect her with Lillian discreetly. He sighed, running a hand over his tired face. But James was a step ahead. He suspected. He never truly believed she was dead. He hired private investigators, as you saw. He intercepted her mail. And when Miranda tried to send that letter to Lillian, the one you found, he got to it first. He sent his own message back to Lillian, a coded one, I suspect, implying Miranda was gone. He manipulated the information, ensured no one would ever truly look for her. He was evil, Eleanor whispered, the words tasting like ash. He was obsessed with control, Mr. Harrison corrected, a grim expression on his face. He found Miranda in Maine. He confronted her. He threatened to kill Thomas if she ever tried to leave, to contact anyone, to reveal herself. He controlled her. He made her believe she was truly dead to the world, that no one would ever look for her. He visited her, sporadically, ensuring her isolation. He kept her a prisoner, effectively, for decades. He broke her spirit. Little by little, he made her believe that the only way Thomas would be safe was if she remained a ghost. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. And Thomas, he knew? No, not at first, Mr. Harrison said, shaking his head. James instilled in Thomas a deep fear of the outside world, of anything that would disgrace the Blackwood name. He told Thomas that his mother had abandoned them, that she had chosen to disappear. He painted a picture of a flighty, irresponsible woman. Thomas only learned the truth in the last few years of James's life, when James himself, succumbing to an illness that affected his mind, began to confess, to brag about his control over Miranda. By then, Miranda's own mind had begun to slip. The years of isolation, fear, and emotional abuse had taken their toll. When James finally died, Thomas brought his mother back to the estate. But it was too late for her memory. The damage was done. Eleanor stared at the lawyer, tears welling in her eyes. The sheer cruelty, the decades of stolen lives, the suffering of both Miranda and Lillian. It was almost too much to bear. "Why didn't you tell Lillian?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you expose James?" Mr. Harrison looked at her, his eyes filled with profound weariness. "James Blackwood was a powerful man, Ms. Vance. He controlled judges, politicians, police. He threatened my family, my career. He threatened to destroy me if I ever spoke a word. I chose to protect my own, and in doing so, I failed your grandmother. It is a burden I have carried for 40 years. A profound regret." He looked down at his hands, old and trembling. "I am so sorry, Miss Vance. So terribly sorry." Eleanor felt a surge of anger, but beneath it, a deeper understanding. The world of James Blackwood had been a dangerous, unforgiving place. Mr. Harrison had made a choice, a terrible one, but one made out of fear. "And the invitation," Eleanor said, her voice softer now. "Tommy sent it, didn't he? Hoping for a miracle?" Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. "Yes, he confided in me. He was desperate. He had seen the Blackwood name on your grandmother's mail. He was sorting through his father's old papers, trying to make sense of the chaos. He remembered Miranda speaking of Lillian. He hoped that seeing a face from her past, someone who knew the truth, might break through the fog of her dementia. He didn't expect it to be you, but perhaps it was meant to be." Eleanor's mind raced. The unsent letter. Lillian's frantic whispers, James's monstrous deception, and now Tommy's desperate plea for a miracle. The pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place, forming a picture far more tragic and complex than she could have ever imagined. But there was one last piece missing, that unsent letter, the one that had held the key for 40 years. She needed to find it, to finally deliver it, not just to Miranda, but to the memory of her beloved grandmother. Chapter 4. The Unsent Letter's Journey. Eleanor left Mr. Harrison's house with a profound sense of purpose. The weight of the untold story, once a heavy burden, now felt like a sacred trust. She had found the truth, the harrowing, heartbreaking truth that had been buried for 40 years. Her grandmother, Lillian, had been right all along. Miranda had been alive, a prisoner of a cruel man's obsession with control and reputation. She immediately called Tommy Blackwood. "Thomas," she said, her voice firm, "I know everything. About your father, about your mother's disappearance, about the farm in Maine." A stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then a ragged sigh. "You spoke to Mr. Harrison?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "And I know about the unsent letter, the one from your mother to Lillian. Your father intercepted it." Tommy's voice was filled with a mixture of shame and relief. I suspected. He had so many secrets. After he died, I found a box of things. Things he didn't want anyone to see. Letters, diaries." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know what to do with them. I just kept them hidden. I was so afraid of what people would say, what it would mean for Mother." Thomas, Eleanor said gently, your mother needs that letter. My grandmother needed that letter. It's the truth that binds them. It's the truth that was stolen. Do you still have it? Yes, he whispered. In a box. In the old study. I'm coming back, Eleanor declared. We're going to find it, together. She drove back to the Blackwood estate, the storm clouds of her emotions mirroring the gathering winter storm outside. When she arrived, Tommy met her at the door, his face etched with exhaustion, but also a dawning hope. He led her directly to James's study, to the hidden compartment behind the desk. Together, they pulled out the old box. Inside, amidst dusty ledgers and legal documents, was a collection of yellowed envelopes, some opened, some still sealed, all addressed to or from Miranda Blackwood, all intercepted by James. And there at the very bottom was the letter Eleanor had glimpsed before, the thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to Lillian Vance. The wax seal was broken, the letter itself already read, its contents absorbing the tragic weight of 40 years of history. Eleanor carefully pulled out the crumpled pages. Her hands trembled as she unfolded them. It was a long, detailed letter, written in Miranda's elegant, flowing script, now faded with time. She began to read aloud, her voice soft but steady, the words echoing in the silent study, bridging the gap of 4 decades. My dearest Lillian, Eleanor read, her voice catching slightly. If you are reading this, then I have made it. I have escaped James's tyranny. I know this must be a shock to hear from me after all this time. The accident was a ruse, Lillian. A desperate, terrifying lie I concocted with Mr. Harrison's help. James. He would have destroyed me if I had tried to leave him openly. He threatened Thomas. He would rather have me dead than divorced, than a blemish on his perfect reputation. I am at a small, isolated farm in Maine, in a place called Birchwood Hollow. It is desolate, but safe. I am trying to build a new life, a quiet one, away from his cruelty. I miss you, my only friend. I miss you terribly. I need your help, Lillian. I need a lifeline. I need you to know I'm alive. I need you to protect Thomas, to tell him one day, if I cannot, that his mother never abandoned him, that she loved him more than life itself. Please, my friend, if this letter reaches you, please come to me. Please, find me. My heart aches for you, for Thomas, for a life free of fear. I am so alone. Eleanor's voice broke. Tears streamed down her face, and Tommy, standing beside her, was openly weeping, his shoulders shaking. The letter was a testament to Miranda's suffering, to Lillian's desperate hope, and to James's monstrous, suffocating control. It was the unsent letter, the truth that had been denied, twisted, and buried. He did this. Tommy choked out, his voice filled with a profound, belated rage and grief. He kept her prisoner all these years. He told me she left us, that she chose to go. Eleanor gently folded the letter. He took everything from her, Thomas, and from Lillian. But now we can give her some of it back. She looked at Tommy, her eyes filled with a new resolve. Your mother, Miranda, she deserves to know the truth. Even if she can't fully grasp it now, she deserves to hear this, to know that Lillian never forgot her, that her friend searched for her, that she was loved. Tommy nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Yes, she does. They found Miranda in her bedroom, a light-filled room overlooking the sea, though she rarely looked out anymore. She sat in a large armchair, gazing blankly at the wall, a faraway look in her eyes. She was frail, her once vibrant beauty faded by age and illness, but her spirit, Eleanor felt, was still there, somewhere beneath the fog. Eleanor sat on a stool beside Miranda, taking her hand. It was thin and papery, but surprisingly warm. Tommy stood quietly by the door, watching. "Miranda," Eleanor began, her voice soft, gentle. "I'm Eleanor, Lillian's granddaughter. Do you remember Lillian?" Miranda's eyes, a faded blue, flickered, a faint shadow of recognition. She murmured something inaudible. "I have something for you, Miranda," Eleanor continued, holding up the unsent letter. "It's a letter, from you, to Lillian. She never got it, but I have it now." Eleanor began to read again, her voice clear, infused with all the emotion of the past 4 decades, of Lillian's longing, Miranda's despair, James's cruelty, and the ultimate triumph of truth. She read of the escape, of Birchwood Hollow, of the fear and the desperate love for Thomas. As she read, Miranda's face, which had been blank, slowly began to change. Her eyes, usually unfocused, seemed to sharpen, to focus on Eleanor's face. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, then another. Her grip on Eleanor's hand tightened, a surprising strength in her frail fingers. When Eleanor finished, the room was silent, save for the soft sound of Miranda's shallow breathing. Miranda looked at Eleanor, her eyes wide, filled with an inexplicable clarity. A flicker of profound understanding, of recognition, passed through them. "Lillian," Miranda whispered, her voice reedy, barely audible but distinctly clear. A small, faint smile touched her lips, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "You found me." She squeezed Eleanor's hand, her gaze piercing. Then, just as quickly, the clarity faded. Her eyes glazed over, the smile softened, and she returned to her distant gaze, the moment of lucid recognition gone. But for Eleanor, it was enough, more than enough. It was a profound, beautiful moment. Miranda, even through the veil of dementia, had remembered. She had known. Lillian's name, their friendship, the truth, it had pierced the fog, even if only for a fleeting second. It was the unsent letter, finally, 40 years later, delivering its message. Chapter 5, Echoes of Truth, A New Beginning. The fleeting moment of clarity in Miranda's eyes, that single whispered word, Lillian, resonated deep within Eleanor's soul. It was a profound vindication for her grandmother, a testament to a friendship that had defied death and deception. It was a confirmation that the invitation, far from being a mistake, was a desperate, hopeful thread connecting 2 shattered halves of a family. Eleanor made a decision. She wouldn't simply leave Martha's Vineyard. She couldn't, not now, not after finally uncovering the truth. She stayed, moving into a small cottage on the estate, to help Thomas care for Miranda. She used her skills as a librarian, not just to organize books, but to organize memories. She helped Thomas sift through the vast, chaotic archives of James Blackwood's life, finding more intercepted letters, more chilling evidence of his obsessive control. Together, they began to piece together a more complete picture of Miranda's life in isolation, the quiet bravery with which she had endured decades of psychological imprisonment. Eleanor created a memory book for Miranda. She filled it with old photographs from Miranda's vibrant youth, pictures of Lillian, of young Thomas, and even photos of the farm in Maine, carefully selected to avoid any images of James. She included excerpts from Miranda's intercepted letters, read aloud in gentle tones, even if Miranda's response was only a fleeting flicker of recognition. She meticulously transcribed Lillian's diary entries, particularly those mentioning Miranda, creating a tangible record of her grandmother's unwavering belief and enduring love. "Look, Miranda," Eleanor would say, turning a page. "This is you with Lillian at the beach. You were so happy." And sometimes Miranda would smile, a soft, wistful smile that hinted at buried joy. Tommy, previously burdened by a lifetime of his father's lies and his mother's suffering, slowly began to heal. He found solace in sharing the truth with Eleanor, in the quiet companionship they built as they cared for Miranda. He learned about the true nature of his father, the monster hidden beneath the veneer of respectability. He also learned about the immense strength of his mother, a woman who had endured unimaginable hardship. The unspoken fear that had clouded his own life began to dissipate. Eleanor, who had always felt a quiet incompleteness, a sense of being adrift, found her purpose on Martha's Vineyard. She realized that her grandmother's whispers, her lifelong grief, were not just a burden, but a legacy. A legacy of truth-seeking, of fierce loyalty, of undying hope. She was no longer just a librarian. She was a truth-teller, a memory keeper, a healer. The story of Miranda Blackwood, once a hushed tragedy, slowly transformed into a testament to human resilience. The official narrative, the one of the tragic boating accident, remained in the public records, but within the walls of the Blackwood estate, a new truth took root, a more profound and beautiful one. As months turned into years, Eleanor maintained her connection with her life in Salem, but her heart remained on the island. She continued her work as a graphic designer, now incorporating the rich history and poignant beauty of Martha's Vineyard into her art. She designed brochures for local historical societies, illustrated children's books inspired by the island's folklore, and even began a personal project, a visual narrative of Miranda's life, a tribute to her survival and spirit. Miranda's 80th birthday had passed, quietly, without the grand celebration the invitation had implied, but in its place, a different kind of celebration had begun, a quiet daily honoring of a life rediscovered, a truth unveiled. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor sat by Miranda's bedside, reading from Lillian's diary. "I will never give up, Miranda," she read, her voice gentle. "I know you are out there. I will always look for you. My heart knows the truth." Miranda, gazing at the ceiling, suddenly turned her head, her faded blue eyes meeting Eleanor's. A tear rolled down her cheek, and she squeezed Eleanor's hand, a silent acknowledgement, a profound connection. Even in the depths of her dementia, the love, the truth, found its way through. Eleanor finally felt whole. The missing pieces of her family history had been found, not in dusty archives, but in the heart of a survivor and the spirit of an unsent letter. She had not only honored her grandmother's legacy, but had also found her own place in a family she never knew she had. The shadows of the past had receded, replaced by the warm, unwavering light of truth, connection, and the enduring power of an unbreakable bond. The unsent letter had finally delivered its message, 40 years late, but perfectly timed, bringing with it not only answers, but a new beginning for Eleanor Vance and the Blackwood family. The echoes of the past had finally found their voice, whispering tales of courage, cruelty, and the ultimate triumph of love and perseverance.